All right. I am here. My name's Eli, by the way, if no one knows who I am. My name is Elias Ayala. I am the founder of Revealed Apologetics Ministry. Also work for the Historical Bible Society doing apologetics related content. Those of you who follow me on YouTube will be familiar with some of these interviews that I like to do. And it is with great pleasure to have Dr. Kirk MacGregor from McPherson College, who is here to talk about two of his books that he wrote, one of which I apologize, I couldn't find my physical copy of your book on Molina. So would you like to quickly tell people the title of that book?
It is Luis de Molina, The Life and Theology of the Founder of Middle Knowledge.
Okay, now would you say that that is for those of people who would be listening to this would be familiar somewhat with some of these current things in theology and things like that? Is your book the only biography written on Molina to date?
Yes.
Okay, so that again another reason to get your hands on it if you're interested in philosophy and theology, especially the topic of divine sovereignty and human freedom and responsibility. Great book that covers the historical issues of Molina's thought and some of his career. But when he gets into some of that theological and philosophical content, there's a lot there to sink our theological teeth in. So, but we'll get to that in just a few moments. We're also going to be talking about uh, Dr. MacGregor's book, Contemporary Theology, an introduction to contemporary theology. I just got finished telling Dr. MacGregor that I'm happy that he was able to write a book on contemporary theology, since, at least to my knowledge, I don't see a lot of books written on that topic from a popular level, and it's very, I mean, it can be intimidating, right, to read stuff like this, but you actually simplify it very well, I think.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm
So
using this as the textbook in a course that I teach right now at McPherson College called Christian Traditions.
uh,
So my students have found it readable and enjoyable. One thing that I've monitored is how well they've been doing on their exams. They just had their second exam of the semester this past Friday, and the vast majority of them did really well. So I've been pleased with the student reception of the book.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, I wish I took your class. I've seen a couple of lectures online. When I purchased this book, I um, I noticed that there were audio lectures
Yes,
available on Audible, and I downloaded that. Now, is there a difference between the content of this? They're lectures, right? So they're not you're not just reading from the material here, right?
that's right. So Zondervan flew me up to their studio in Grand Rapids in January of 2018 to film over the course of 4 days a 15 to 20-minute video corresponding to each of the book's 38 chapters. And what Zondervan then did is take the video, or excuse me, take the audio from those video lectures and market those as a product all its own. So you can either watch it on the video or you can listen to it on the audio lectures.
Hmm.
But it's really nice for students who happen to miss a class and want a nice 15 to 20-minute summary of what we talked about that day for 50 minutes. So I just tell them to go over to the library and to play the chapter for that day so that they're pretty much caught up and brought up to speed.
Yeah, and it's great that you do them. So it can be weird when you hear the audio book when a guy who didn't even book
Yeah,
is talking. So you know, someone could have the impression that Dr. MacGregor sounds like, you know, a deep voiced, you know, it is
yes.
completely, yeah. So it's cool that you do the lectures there, so we kind of get a feel of that consistency between the pages and just the thought behind that. So it's really cool. I mean, the table of contents covers some pretty cool and diverse topics. You go from Friedrich Schleiermacher, Hegel, Soren Kierkegaard, and then you even talk a little bit about the development of Pentecostalism, dispensationalism, the death of God theology. I like Chinese eschatology. I mean, very diverse. So you even cover open theism. So I actually think that this book is even helpful for those studying apologetics.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe we can talk about that in a little bit. But the book before this one, I'm not sure if you've written a book if the book on Molina was the book directly before this one, or maybe you've written something in between. But
It's the book directly before this one.
okay, so your first book, not ever, but your first book on Molina. Let's kind of cover that here. Now, again, I don't have a physical copy, but if you can tell folks what made you interested in Molina as a historical figure and Molina as someone who's contributed to philosophical and theological thought in relation to the particular context that he was in.
I come out of a Church of the Brethren tradition. For those who don't know, the Church of the Brethren is a denomination within Anabaptism and Pietism, which originated in the 1700s. And that tradition really doesn't deal as a major area of concern with the issue of predestination and human freedom. I think that it's taken for granted that human beings have libertarian free will, although they wouldn't use that language. But certainly, people in my denomination would say that people are able to choose between the alternatives and that that's necessary to make a genuine choice. And as I, growing up, was reading through the Bible, I wondered what to make of the passages concerning divine sovereignty, divine providence, divine predestination, because I didn't feel like one could just explain those away, as I felt that at least those Arminians that I happen to know seem to do. And on the other hand, I knew that those passages could not be in contradiction to passages indicating God's universal saving will or passages teaching genuine human freedom. So I was really interested all the way back at the beginning of my undergraduate days as to how to reconcile these two. And in my own tradition, there is more of an activism, for example, working to benefit those who are poor in other countries, working, say, for the Haiti Water Project or for Heifer International, which are outstanding ways to really be the hands and the feet of Christ in the world. But oftentimes, less attention was paid to how to reconcile philosophical quandaries. So people in my tradition would say, well, somehow they're both true. They wouldn't give me any reconciliation as to how. So one thing that I think Brethren tradition did correctly was not to privilege one set of Bible passages against another, or try to read one set of Bible passages through the lens of another. But what they didn't do so well on is to give me a philosophical framework by which I could make sense of how these two fit together. Just telling me that they fit together wasn't enough. And so that was kind of an issue. It wasn't an issue that kept me awake at night. I've said in many occasions that I have a version of obsessive compulsive disorder. I know what it is to obsess about things, and that was not something I ever obsessed about. So I kind of had it on the back burner as an interest of mine, but that's really all it remained. And that was until I did my master's degree at Biola University and heard William Lane Craig speak about Molinism and how Molinism avoided many of the problems plaguing open theism. And when I heard Craig speak about this, I thought, here's something with the power to reconcile these biblical passages that I knew that somehow they had to fit together, and I could see that they weren't contradictory, but I just didn't know how they fit together. It's like two puzzle pieces that you can't squish together. And so when I heard of Molinism for the first time, I began to read more and more and more about it. And after the course of, I'd say around 6 months, probably by May of 2001, I had read probably everything that there was out there in the philosophical and theological literature on Molinism. So
6 months?
Yeah. And I thought that, well, I knew that if I wanted to do anything further with this, it would be really good if I did all of that reading while I was still in my master's program, because I was going on to doctoral studies at the University of Iowa in the fall of 2001. And I realized that although the impact of Molinism had been explained, especially concerning the three different logical moments of God's knowledge and how those fit with God's divine decree to create the world. Nevertheless, there was a gaping hole when it came to understanding the figure Luis de Molina, as well as how he arrived at the doctrines that he is so well known for.
Mhm.
And one thing that I also was quite surprised about, because I didn't hear of this at all from, say, folks at Ayala, is Molina's extreme importance as a fighter for social justice, as a person who championed equality, who fought against the slave trade at a very early era, and the contributions that, say, economic historians take for granted. Economic historians and political historians see Molina as a pivotal figure, and they really minimize his theology. And it
Mm.
seems like theologians do exactly the opposite. And so I wondered, well, why is it that there doesn't seem to be any biography of Luis de Molina, which describes his life and the development of his thought in its historical context? And when I did my doctoral studies and really got heavy into studies of Latin, because all of Molina's works are in Latin, I quickly learned the answer. So I got my hands around 2003 on the Latin critical edition of the Concordia. And even then I saw, oh my goodness, it hadn't dawned on me. It doesn't dawn on you until you see it, that
Mm.
here's this massive volume. Only 1/7 of this, only book 4 of the 7-volume Concordia has been translated into English. And the first book of the Concordia deals with the biblical foundations of Molinism, which it always astonishes me when critics of Molinism say it's a purely philosophical position without any biblical foundation, because Molina actually begins the Concordia by walking through the biblical passages that he thinks goes to establish what we would call the framework of natural, middle, divine creative decree, and then free knowledge.
Mhm.
And then Molina works through human free will. And then he talks about providence. And book 7, by the time he gets to book 7, he's dealing explicitly with the issue of predestination. And we get his own exegesis of important texts like Romans chapter 9 and Ephesians chapter 2 and 1 Peter chapter 1. So I thought all of this needs to really be brought to light. But Molina's Latin is incredibly dense. There's a reason why I don't see anytime soon anybody making a translation of even like the entire Concordia. I mean, Thomas Flint um, has commented that Molina's Latin is so impenetrable at times that you've got a 20-line sentence, not a 20-line paragraph, a 20-line sentence that basically serves as the equivalent of a paragraph, with clause after subclause after subclause after subclause. And if you're good at Latin, which I happen to have a good facility with the languages, then I can read it and know what Molina is saying. But it takes a long time to translate that into readable English. And so when I was writing the book on Molina, the hardest part for me was the direct quotations from the Concordia or from Molina's other massive work on social justice, De Justitia et Jure, on justice and law, because I would first have to read it, paraphrase it in my own words, break it down into manageable sentences,
Okay.
and then work at it until it was readable. And so to translate, say, a 150 word quote, that would take me around 2 hours to do. So, and if you keep adding that up, what I was trying to do, it's a lot quicker if you know Latin to be able to read Molina and to know yourself what he's saying than it is to actually give a good translation of Molina's words. And so I knew everything that the Concordia said, but I would pick out what I took to be the key paragraphs, and I would be sure to translate those into English so that without having to actually take up Molina's Concordia or to learn Latin, people could know the major highlights of books 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7 in the Concordia. And the same is true with Molina's work on social justice. That has never in any part been translated into English for exactly the same reason. And I did the same thing with Molina's De Justitia et Jure on justice and law in chapters 7 and 8 of that book.
Now, would you attribute Molina's marginalization throughout church history to the difficulty of translating his work? It seems that when we take a look at I mean, for those who might not know who
Yeah.
Molina is, I mean, he was a counter reformer, he was a Jesuit, and he was commissioned to really produce a response to the Reformed perspective, right?
No, he wasn't commissioned to produce a
Okay.
response to the Reformed perspective. Um, it's simply that he didn't think that Luther and Calvin um, understood philosophical theology very well, quite frankly. That he didn't feel this way.
Hmm.
And it wasn't anything that he was commissioned to do, because Molina himself had had some issues with at least certain variants of Roman Catholic theology of his day. I
Okay.
mean, Molina was strenuously opposed by the Dominicans, by the Thomists in his day, and even by several members of the Jesuit order. So really, that is one half of why Molina was marginalized. So I'll go through both halves. The
Okay.
first half is that Molina is producing the Concordia on the heels of the Council of Trent. Council of Trent held between 1545 and 1563.
Okay.
And the Council of Trent essentially made Thomism the chief position, not the official position. That would come later with Vatican I. Well, actually, the aftermath of Vatican I. Vatican I is 1870 to 1871, and Leo XIII wrote an encyclical in 1879, which essentially made Thomism the official doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. But Thomism became almost elevated to that level at the Council of Trent. So when you have Molina, who sees a lot of value in Aquinas, but thinks that Aquinas needs to be revised on key issues, such that the first work where Molina got his start was as a commentary on the Summa Theologiae of Thomas. And in his commentary, it was sort of his sly way of doing it. You couldn't write a work after the Council of Trent saying, I disagree with Thomas and here's why, and remain in good standing as a Catholic. What you could do is to write a commentary and say, here's the best way to interpret what Thomas is saying. And oftentimes his interpretation of what Thomas is saying is definitely not what Thomas Aquinas historically intended. Oftentimes it's quite the opposite. And the Thomists of Molina's day realized that, and they strenuously opposed him. So the way Molina presents middle knowledge, he presents it as entirely consistent with Thomism. In fact, he thinks if you're a fully consistent Thomist, that this is the direction that you're going to go. And the Thomists who were alive in his day said, I don't think so. We've never seen this before. This looks like innovation. This looks like heresy. We want absolutely nothing to do with it. And so immediately after it left the press, the Concordia was attacked by Roman Catholics. So Roman Catholics attacked the Concordia. And so that was Molina's bitter opposition during his lifetime. Really, the Protestant opposition to Molina doesn't even exist in Molina's lifetime. So it's long after Molina that around Molina dies in 1600, but it would be around 1605, 1606 that Jacob Arminius, he's heard of sort of the commotion, the hullabaloo concerning middle knowledge.
Mhm.
And he uses the term middle knowledge only a few times, 2 or 3 times in the entirety of his works. And when he uses the term, he fits it into his own system. So the one thing I argue in the book is that Molina would actually correct him on how he interpreted middle knowledge. Molina would not agree with Arminius's understanding of middle knowledge. But because people knew middle knowledge, this has something to do with Molina, this is Catholic, and when all of this came in front of the Synod of Dort between 1618 and 1619, when the Synod of Dort denounced Arminianism, it denounced Molina's thought as well, which effectively barred Molina from becoming a live option within Reform circles. And so if Catholics aren't going to read Molina, and the Reformed aren't going to read Molina, and the Lutherans really aren't concerned about this issue, and the Anabaptists, they're not looking at any Roman Catholic thinkers. For goodness sake, they're being persecuted. They're being burned at the stake for trying to separate church and state and practicing believers' baptism. Of course it was lost very soon after Molina's time.
Mm. So Molina's work wouldn't become an area of attention until when? So you have Molina, and then after Molina, you have kind of Molinism adopted by Jacob Arminius, who really didn't present it correctly, and so when these issues came up at the Synod of Dort, Protestants rejected this, and so he became marginalized.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
point? At what point in history, and what person specifically revitalizes work such that it's now it's really a very growing topic of concern today on the theological and philosophical landscape?
Would be Alvin Plantinga in 1973 with his book God, Freedom, and Evil, in order to present a response to the infamous problem of evil. Alvin Plantinga, without realizing it, really reinvented some of the core tenets of Molinism, and essentially this idea of middle knowledge, thinking along the lines, well, if God is omniscient, then God knows all truths that are logically possible to know, and it seems logically possible for God to know before his decision to create the world what any free individual would do in any conceivable set of circumstances. And so he uses this to try to answer the problem of evil. But at that point, Plantinga was teaching at Calvin College, which is obviously not, anything having to do with Jesuit thought. And so it would take really an expert in Jesuit thought to track down if there was any historical predecessors to Plantinga's thought. And this was first detected in 1977 when reviewers of Plantinga's work said this is basically reviving exactly what this late 16th century Spanish reformer was talking about in terms of his doctrine of middle knowledge. And Plantinga was like, really? Somebody said this type of stuff before? And so he began looking into Molina and Molina's work, and he became convinced that one could simultaneously be a Calvinist and a Molinist. And this had nothing to do with his leaving Calvin College. He was offered an endowed chair at the University of Notre Dame and took it. And then really, rose to prominence with his trilogy concerning religious epistemology.
Sure.
But he really got the ball rolling with, okay, if you want to try to work on the problem of evil, then Molina is a thinker that we need to pay attention to, especially when Plantinga says, yes, now I've read him and I agree with him. And
Right.
so many of Plantinga's colleagues at Notre Dame at the time, such as Alfred Freddoso, began to dive into Molina's works. And so Freddoso, by the year 1988, had produced the translation, still the critical English translation, of Book 4 of the Concordia, the book that's specifically dealing with on divine foreknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So he starts working on this. Other Molinist thinkers who are influenced by Plantinga and Freddoso and what's going on at Notre Dame, such as Thomas Flint, William Lane Craig, did his PhD in philosophy at Birmingham in 1977.
Right.
He is just starting to work in this area and beginning to explore the sources. And so it's probably by around the mid 90s that there's a collection of maybe, 10 to 15 scholars who are really doing excellent work on Molinism, on doing a little bit of putting Molina in his context, although not doing anything like telling his life story, but at least making
where he fits in history,
where Molina came from. Yeah.
Where he fits in history. Okay, so this is interesting. Would you attribute the common accusation, usually coming from the Reformed camp and people who don't agree with Molinism? The accusation is that Molinism is kind of a philosophy that's kind of blanketed over Scripture as opposed to something derived from Scripture. That accusation, would you say, comes from the fact that those who learned Molinism learned it from philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and others who have not yet availed themselves or maybe relayed biblical reasoning that Molina wrote in his untranslated work?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That certainly that was not Molina's motivation, nor was it Molina's progression in thinking. But if you basically start out with the philosophy and you haven't really thought through how this is biblically grounded or investigated how it's biblically grounded, then a thinker in their own mind is going to be using it as a philosophical grid through which scripture can be interpreted. Now, people in the Reformed camp think that that is the wrong framework for interpreting scripture. I actually don't really have a problem with a framework like that as long as you've got the right framework. I tend to kind of be on the side of, the scholastics who tended to think philosophy before theology. But I know that's not speaking for the Reformed camp. My wife would say, no, you've got that completely backwards there. But yeah, so because of the fact that
So, 1 second, I have to pull this apart real quick.
Yeah.
Your wife is she a Calvinist or is she also a Molinist with along the lines of your position?
She is both a Calvinist and a Molinist. She
Okay.
agrees with Plantinga, and it's interesting. There's an article that I wrote for Tim Stratton's website on can one be a Molinist and a Calvinist, and I told him that my motivation for writing that is my conversations with my wife because I've seen it firsthand with her. So
your wife is a
story behind that.
Your wife is a 5-point Calvinist.
She's a Presbyterian pastor.
Okay, so you think that 5-point Calvinism is consistent with Molinism? Okay, and then okay, and whether one agrees with that or not, what I like about that kind of project is that, as you've mentioned a while back when we had spoken, that your desire is to build bridges between the different. Now, whether you build the bridge successfully or not, we can't fault one for desiring to do that, since these different theological camps do bicker, and it is good to communicate and clarify these issues. So, yeah. All right. Well, if you could summarize for people who may not know what Molinism is, can you summarize the perspective briefly, and then explain to us the question it tries to solve, and then we'll kind of make a transition into discussing your book on contemporary theology.
Yeah. So I'll lay out the problem the way Molina does in book 1 of the Concordia. Molina says you've got biblical passages which, in his reading, very clearly teach that God is provident over the course of history, that God knows the end from the beginning, that God works together all things for good to those who love him, that God also predestines various individuals to salvation. So Molina knew of Calvin's exegesis of Romans 9 and agreed with it on the exegetical level. He disagreed with the unspoken philosophy as he saw it, and I agree with him, that Calvin did from that. But he agreed with the exegesis in and of itself, that Romans 9 is talking about sovereign individual election. And Molina said that's a scriptural datum that needs to be explained. You've also got a scriptural datum describing God's universal saving will, that God so loved the world, that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance, that Jesus is the Savior of all people, especially those who believe, that God desires the salvation of all persons and wants all persons to come into a knowledge of the truth. Passages such as that. And then you've got the third piece of the puzzle, which is the affirmation of what philosophers would call libertarian freedom. And the classic text for this is in Deuteronomy 30, 10 to 20, where God is giving to the children of Israel the law, which Christians today think, the law is really impossible. It's got all of these, horrible demands. It's like, I could never be an Orthodox Jew because I love Red Lobster too much, that kind of thing. But Christians think of the law.
I'm a big seafood guy, so
really, really tough. And Moses, after receiving the law and giving it to the second generation of Israelites, amazingly says to them, "Now, concerning all these things that I've told you, this is not too hard for you to do." And in case somebody says, "Well, that's just the ceremonial parts of the law," it's not hard to abstain from shellfish and abstain from pork and all that. He explicitly cites loving Yahweh your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. He says, okay, now that part, that's not too hard for you guys to do. That's not beyond your reach, which to both Molina and me says that's at least the way Calvin presents total inability. That doesn't match. So Moses says, I've set before you today two options, life and death, blessings and curses. You choose. Choose life in order that you may live. So there it seems very clearly that you are choosing between opposites. And one pair of those opposites is whether you're going to love God or whether you're going to not. And that it's not too hard for you to make that decision. And we know full well, all you got to do is read Deuteronomy and Joshua and so forth to know that all those folks were not regenerate. So it's not like all those folks had gotten sort of zapped with irresistible grace before that was said.
Now, what passage is that? Deuteronomy chapter
30, 10 to 20. So Molina says you've got these passages. And then he said, what you need to put them together is some way. He says, look, none of these are the contradiction of the other. There's no logical contradiction between them. So what we need is, well, let's look at the type of knowledge that God has. So in Scripture, you find that God not only has knowledge of all possibilities and knowledge of all future abilities, if that's a word, but I've seen it used in the philosophical literature, that God also has knowledge of everything that would happen under any conceivable set of circumstances. What philosophers call counterfactuals. And I always explain to my students, counterfactuals doesn't necessarily mean contrary to fact, because several counterfactuals can be in accord with that. It's just saying that if such and such were the case, then such and such would be the case. and that you've got God's knowledge of this throughout Scripture. You know, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you can produce passages, you know, starting in Genesis with the account of Joseph and his brothers and the reconciliation through David at Keilah, his decision to leave Keilah on the basis that if he were to remain, then Saul would come and try to get him, and the people of Keilah would hand him over to Saul, to Jesus' statement about the different salvific fate of people, depending on where exactly they were living, the circumstances that they were in. So, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles that were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Or, you know, woe to you, Capernaum, you think you're going to be brought to heaven, you're going to be brought down to the depths, for if the miracles done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. You know, and Jesus saying about the Jewish religious leaders, if I had not come and done the miracles among them which no one else did, they would not have sinned. Paul, if the rulers of this age did not understand this, if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So you take that, Molina says, oh, when you add that puzzle piece, then everything fits together, now doesn't it? And so that's where he starts. He says, we've got now all the puzzle pieces. The reason why we didn't have it before is because we were missing that one puzzle piece. And it has the little conjoining links that you can use to fill in all the rest. So what Molinism tries to do is then to philosophically unpack what that looks like. So since God is, at least, you know, prior to the creation of the universe, you know, God is timeless. And there's no such thing as like God learning anything.
Right.
What that means is that if you're talking about different types of God's knowledge, you're talking about a logical structure, a logical order. The analogy that I give my students to make sense of this is that let's suppose that I live in Kansas, so let's suppose I'm on I-35. I'm going 75 on the speed on the highway because that's the speed limit. I cross over into Oklahoma where the speed limit is 70, but I don't slow down. Well, at one and the same moment, I enter the state of Oklahoma. I am subject to Oklahoma's speed laws, and I am speeding. All of those happen at one and the same moment. Now let's even, you know, stir up the pot a little bit. Let's suppose that at the moment that happened, the fourth dimension of the universe collapsed so that there was no longer any time. In that case, it would be timelessly true that I was in Oklahoma, I was subject to Oklahoma speed laws, and I was speeding. But if you're asking, how do those logically line up? If you're going to logically line those up, then how would they go? And when you're logically lining things up, you're asking the question, what explains the other? So that you couldn't make sense of the second thing without the first thing, and you can't make sense of the third thing without the second thing. Well, think of it this way. Suppose you're thinking about my being subject to Oklahoma speed laws. Is that logically before or logically after my entering into Oklahoma? Well, if
Can you repeat that last?
right. Logically speaking, if I wasn't in Oklahoma, I wouldn't be subject to the speed laws. But given that I'm in Oklahoma, that explains why I'm subject to their speed laws. And so, logical moment one, I'm in Oklahoma. Logical moment two, I'm subject to their speed laws. And then you ask, well, what about your speeding? Well, if I wasn't subject to their speed laws, I wouldn't be speeding. But given that I am subject to their speed laws, that explains why I'm speeding. And so my speeding is moment three. So moment one, enter Oklahoma. Two, subject to their speed laws. Three, am speeding. In God's knowledge, it works in exactly the same way. Step one, you have what's called middle knowledge, God's knowledge of everything that could be. Step two, God's middle knowledge, knowledge of everything that would be. Step three, free knowledge, God's knowledge of everything that will be.
And for those who may be lost, because there are people that are listening in, I'm getting notifications here. what you did there in using that analogy was to show that the moments of God's knowledge are not temporally and chronologically related, but are
Correct.
logically related. And
Right.
and that God has these logical moments in a timeless state
Yeah.
prior to the creation of, or prior to
Right.
decreeing,
Right.
right? Okay.
The best way I can put it is this. When logicians use the word moments, they use it as a façon de parler. In other words, as a figure of speech. They
Mhm.
don't mean it in, they don't mean a temporal moment. And if there were such a thing as a timeless moment, they wouldn't mean a timeless moment either. Rather,
Mhm.
they mean an explanatory step. What
Okay.
you need for one thing to make sense of the other, and
Okay.
putting things in logical sequence. So that's the sense of moment that one means when one says that there are these three moments in God's knowledge.
So middle knowledge ultimately is the view that God has three logical moments, which is an aspect of his omniscience, right? You
That,
have
that God's knowledge can be logically unpacked in terms of three different stages, three different
natural
steps:
knowledge,
middle
middle knowledge,
knowledge and free knowledge.
three.
Yep, the divine creative decree. And I didn't list that simply because that's not an aspect of knowledge. That's a logically intervening act of God's will, that God chooses what among the worlds that God knows that are logically possible to create, given human freedom and given contingency and indeterminacy and so forth, that God chooses among them
Mhm.
one that God is going to create, and then you have God's free knowledge, right?
So because Molinists understand God having these three moments of knowledge, Molina and Molinists in general, I
Yeah,
suppose, understand that one could answer the philosophical and theological puzzle of the twin biblical truths of God's meticulous sovereignty and human freedom and
right,
responsibility.
right,
And so the purpose of Molinism really is to make sense out of the biblical data to explain that. It kind of gives us a model in which we can reconcile those twin truths.
right,
Right. Right.
right,
And that's not to say, and I know there are a lot of Calvinists that would be listening to this too, that's not to say necessarily that the position is true or false. That's
right,
debated. But
right,
as many other people try to give a metaphysical model as to how this all works, Molinism is another way of seeing those things, and people are willing to defend it and have defended it quite vigorously.
mm-hmm,
And this is kind of a very important aspect of the broader discussion.
mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. I think this stuff is fascinating. I can talk about Molinism and Calvinism forever till the cows come home, but let's move on.
All right,
Uh, we don't have too much time left, but I want to get to talk a little bit about this book. So we're switching gears, completely different.
all right,
Okay, okay. So now we we're talking about your previous book, and I suppose not the book directly, but stuff that's covered in the book, the historical development of Molinism, and you unpack the view. I think people might be interested to know that Molina's understanding of Romans 9 is, for Calvinists who may be listening, is that he affirmed individual predestination, correct? Right. So very similar to how Calvinists would understand it. Of
yeah,
course, we wouldn't have that Molinist twist to the whole way of
yeah,
understanding. All right. Well, thank you so much for that, and I hope that people don't have a Charlie horse in between the ears, but that is quite okay. It's good to think about these things. So let's move on to your book on an introduction to contemporary theology. Question: what inspired you to write a book on contemporary theology as opposed to some other aspect of theology? Yeah, go for it.
When I was a master's student at Ayala, I had a course in contemporary theology, and I found that the thinkers that I was presented with only represented a narrow stream in contemporary theology. So that in preparation for doctoral studies, I was doing a lot of outside reading. And as you probably gathered already, I tend to do a lot of outside reading. I want to know everything that's going on in the areas that I study. And I was discovering all of these streams of thought that I wasn't getting out of my contemporary theology class, which were just as important. And I can remember, early on in April of 2001, where I was walking on the Biola University campus when I said, someday I need to write a textbook in contemporary theology. And then when I was a doctoral student in Iowa, I had a seminar in contemporary theology. And it was the same situation, but with different thinkers, where I got a stream of thought that resonated with where my professor was going with the course, but it didn't represent everything that was going on in contemporary theology. And so it seemed to me, as I graduated from Iowa in 2005, that I taught at various universities and colleges, and I was asked to teach courses like Christian thought, or history of Christianity 2, or Christian traditions, or contemporary Christian thought, things like that. That in teaching those types of courses, the way I was putting things together, I didn't really have one go-to textbook that I could use. And so it seemed to me that I was assigning a whole bunch of readings from different places, and students don't like that because it means they have to buy like at least 4 different books rather than one. So it seemed to me that you could basically subdivide contemporary theology, by which I define as basically theology over the last 200 years or so, into 4 different streams. You've got what I would call the classical stream, and that's sort of what is most widely studied in contemporary theology. So you talk about Friedrich Schleiermacher, you talk about Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Søren Kierkegaard, Karl Barth, Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich, death of God theology, process theology, that type of thing. That's kind of the classical approach. That's what you would get at most college classrooms and seminary classrooms. Then it seemed to me that there was a very strong evangelical presence that was missed, that there were major figures and movements in evangelicalism that were being underappreciated by evangelical scholars themselves, of all things. So I'm thinking, look, if you experience Spurgeon in his historical context, he was a great contemporary theologian. Why isn't he in this conversation? Because he's responding to what like Schleiermacher and Hegel and Kierkegaard are doing, but nobody's talking about him. What about Moody? D.L. Moody, who established crusades across the U.S. and Britain and elsewhere in Europe, that he needs to be part of this conversation. What about Princeton theology, where Princeton theology is still, I would argue, the dominant mode according to which Reformed thinkers do theology? And there wasn't attention paid to Princeton theology. There wasn't attention paid to how the movement called fundamentalism came into being in the 19-teens and the 1920s. You would hear in passing talk about the fundamentalist modernist controversy, but never really an account of who the fundamentalists were, what shaped them, what motivated them, and what became of them. And then how out of those forces, taking all those as ingredients, you get such a thing as contemporary evangelicalism and various debates that go on in contemporary evangelicalism, like complementarianism versus egalitarianism. Plantinga's work in Reformed epistemology, the idea of open theism, the idea of the philosophical renaissance in over the past half century in philosophy of religion. And so I moved from there to the philosophical stream. Where are philosophers and theologians overlapping? Where are many philosophers also theologians and vice versa? What major philosophical developments do you need to know to understand modern theology today? And so there's the philosophical as the third. And then finally, global perspectives. I find that most Christians have no idea, like, about what Latin American Pentecostals believe, or about African Christology, or about Chinese
Thought that chapter was interesting.
yeah. And what's amazing is you need to talk about what's going on around the globe because, to put it frankly, the West just ain't where the action is. We may think so, but that's our own bias. 67% of the world's Christians live outside the West. They live in places like South America and Africa and Asia. And so that's the majority of the world's Christians. And so we need to hear their voices so that we can learn from them. A lot of times Western thinkers believe they have it all together. We need to learn from them, see what they're doing, and see why, in some cases, they will pray for what's going on in America because they think America has kind of gone off the tracks.
What I think too, which is funny about a lot of American Christianity, especially within my own camp, me being a Calvinist myself, there is this very loose, and I think sometimes it's warranted, but a very loose throwing around of the word heresy, and everything that's called heresy we just avoid because we disagree with it, and we don't tend to read a lot of what the other side is offering, and it can kind of cater to a sort of closed-mindedness. And I think you're right. I think part of mature scholarship is to have the ability to entertain ideas that you don't agree with,
Yeah,
so as to understand it and then interact with it and kind of understand how it fits in within the broader scope of theology and history and things like that. So, and again, some of the chapters in this book that I just never, I mean, I've studied theology for a long time. I just never thought about it. I mean, that chapter on, let me see if I can find it here, African
Christology. Yeah.
Christology, my goodness. And very enlightening to see Christ from that perspective.
Yes.
Whether they do it correctly or not, it's very interesting to see how universal the person of Christ can be applied, how universally can be applied. Yeah, excellent book. And people would be surprised as to how easy it is. I mean, reading it, I mean, believe me, I read a lot. Sometimes there's some, I have what is we have here. I have Philosophical Foundations, Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. Those are pretty dense books. They're pretty, you really kind of have to read through it slowly. This book, while you still have to read through it, with care,
Yeah.
was very understandable, and I think the average Christian who's interested in theology should really get their hands on a book like this.
Yeah.
Now, if I can ask this,
yeah, that's who I designed it for. I designed it for my students so that I could use it in the classroom. And
right.
I wrote that book. So I got the book contract with Zondervan in 2006. And so I taught in the spring of, 2016. In the spring of 2017 and in the spring of 2018, I was teaching the course Christian Traditions. And I booked the course on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 12:30 to 1:50, and then I booked my office hours from 2 to 5 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if nobody showed up, then I could actually begin to write chapters based on what I was presenting in class. So it's sort of like I've already said this once to my students. Now it's a matter of simply putting those words to the page. So oftentimes the reason why some books aren't as readable as others is that you haven't tried first to lecture through it. You've just thought through it, and then if you read it, other scholars will understand because they'll get the lingo, but other people won't. But if you started out by lecturing to undergraduates, and then you're like, okay, now I just have to put what I said basically down in the next 3 hours before I go home for the day, then it's a different story. And I think that strategy in writing the book worked very well in making it readable. As I say, my students are having real success with it.
Wonderful. Now, I want to kind of ask a question that's more on the practical side. Not that this hasn't been practical, but what do you think the value of a book like this has for people who are interested in apologetics?
I think it has tremendous value. One thing that I think is that I've heard many people talk about is that this is a book that people who have any type of inclinations about apologetics, they need to have this as background information. Because if you're going to do apologetics, you need to know all the different views that are out there.
Right.
Because if you don't, then you're either going to be hit with something that you've never heard of before, or you're going to be completely ignoring all of these things in the academy and in certain Christian churches, and you're just going to be letting them go, saying, well, we're not going to worry about that. But, for example, if you know what post-liberal theology is, you know the basic tenets of that thought, then if you go to a church or if you're attending a church and you see it, you know it immediately when you see it. You're like, okay, now I understand what this is. And if you disagree with it, you can start thinking through, all right, I know what this is. This isn't just my pastor saying some weird stuff today. Sometimes pastors, I found that they'll say weird stuff and you're like, where did they get that from? More often than not, it's based on a philosophical or theological position that they hold, but they're not articulating. And so you can immediately track down, okay, this is where this is coming from. And in order to engage with this person, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, you need to first know the rules of the game. And what my book teaches you is sort of how it works for a liberal theologian, how it works for an existentialist theologian, how it works for an open theist, how it works for an adherent of Plantinga's thought, how it works for someone who's an analytic theologian, how it works for a post-conservative evangelical. And so, as a result of knowing this, you'll be able to formulate, whether you agree or disagree with it, your response to it. And you're willing and ready to engage that when you see it happening right in front of your eyes.
Yeah, and I think you do a good job in representing and explaining each respective position. It's almost as when you read through, it's kind of like, is Dr. MacGregor an open theist? Oh no, he's just being really careful and honest as to how he's representing the perspective.
Yeah.
And for people who see the history of theology as something that is a vast topic that is just, it's impossible to digest, I think a book like that, I mean, the chapters aren't terribly long either.
No, they're not.
Yeah, and
students to read them. I knew they wouldn't read them if they were.
yeah, well, that's true. But they're not long, but they're not too short, and you capture enough there to think about each of the topics, and it's digestible. And I again, I agree that it does have one of the main reasons why I purchased this book is I think you're a super smart guy and you have a lot of good things to say. That's one reason. But the other reason is I'm always trying to prepare myself to engage in apologetics at various levels, and I knew that a topic like this is important since these ideas still are influential today.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think, and maybe it's a silly question, maybe it's not, what do you think influences today's thought? Contemporary theology or theological issues that have gone a little bit before that? So we kind of break up the theological landscape, contemporary and kind of the other stuff in the past. Are we still influenced by the ancient stuff in a way that perhaps the contemporary stuff is not? Or what do you find more of a challenge apologetically on the theological landscape today?
I find more challenging the contemporary stuff by far, because when somebody says, for example, that's true for you, but it's not true for me, that doesn't come out of the Reformation.
Right.
That people don't realize it, but that is Ludwig Wittgenstein 101. Wittgenstein invented that. You better know who Wittgenstein is. You better understand Wittgenstein's theory of language names, and you better understand Wittgenstein's distinction between truth and fact, and what makes something true in his mind theologically. It's only by understanding all of that that you're really able to deal with the it's true for you, but not for me. Just the standard, well, that doesn't work because it's logically silly, isn't going to cut it. if you've got someone who really is abreast of Wittgenstein and schooled in his work, or comes from those presuppositions, because they think of each different domain as a different language game, and each language game has its own rules, so that what's true in one language game may well not be true for another, according to the rules of the game. And according to Wittgenstein, in theology, in the language game of theology, truth is not at all defined in terms of fact. And this is something that I really have to make my students, wrap their head around, that I'm saying this. But for Wittgenstein, it makes perfect sense to talk about a true lie. And it makes perfect sense to talk about a false fact. Because Wittgenstein thinks in the language game of theology, what makes something true is the degree that it enables you to tap into this depth dimension of human experience. In other words, the dimension of meaning, value, being, purpose, and something that has a tried and true value in enabling people to get at that deeper dimension of human experience. That is going to be, in the language game of theology for him, quote, true, even though it may be a blatant lie. It may not correspond at all to things that happened in the world.
Right.
Wittgenstein would say there are many false facts. For example, 2 + 2 = 4. It's a fact, but he'd say it's false. It doesn't connect anyone with the depth dimension of human experience. It doesn't help anybody in their account for meaning and value and purpose.
And when we say that,
yeah,
when we say that that's logically inconsistent, we miss the point, because we're applying the rules of our language game to a different language game.
In their thinking, yes. In their thinking, that's absolutely
their
right.
thinking.
That when the person says that's true for you but not for me, what they mean to say is, this enables me to find meaning, purpose, value in my life. This connects me in a real experiential way to the divine. It may not for you, but it does for me. And in the language game of religion, that's what the word true means. So it's true for you, but not for me.
Yeah. Now, what would you think? 2 questions. What was your favorite chapter to write? And what do you think is the most important chapter in your book? That obviously all of it's important, but if you had to strip away every single chapter in your book and only leave one, it'd be like a little pamphlet size, But which was your favorite chapter to write, and what do you think is the most important chapter for someone to make sure they read if they purchase this book?
Okay. For me, the most enjoyable chapter to write was the last one. And the reason that was the one on post-conservative theology. And the reason that was my favorite to write is because I think that is a stream of evangelicalism that is oftentimes maligned by other evangelicals as being things that we absolutely cannot consider. And while I don't agree with everything in the movement, there are definitely things that I do agree with. And I think that it's something that needs to be put on the table. So that was my favorite chapter to write, just because I enjoy the material. I enjoy it even when I disagree with the position. So especially when like post-conservatives have a lower view on philosophy than I would. Still, I enjoy writing about that. So that was fun for me to write. I think the most valuable chapter was the chapter on philosophy of religion and analytic theology. Because as I say, if you want the most creative strides in theology today, really it is being done by philosophers of religion and philosophical theologians, whether anybody likes it or not. That's just that. And that the best work has been done on topics like the Trinity, topics like Christology, predestination and human freedom, the problem of evil, as well as being able to give a reasonable faith, being able to give a faith which has evidential support and is consistent with being a fully apprised, scientifically minded person about the world. So that chapter, I think, is the most important. But I would never try to strip the book down to one chapter, because you can't do that. You need the whole book, which is why I wrote it.
Last question, and then we'll wrap it up. And I thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this. Again, I can talk about this stuff forever. I actually have I'll be teaching a class on the resurrection of Jesus, and I'll actually be speaking at a high school tomorrow, talking about the evidence for the resurrection to a mixed crowd. So I'm really excited about that. But just to wrap things up real quick, if in regards to both of your books, the one on Molina and the one in contemporary theology, if one had to be pulled, which one would you want to stay? Which one you think is more important?
I can't even answer that question. That's like,
I really love studies in Molina. I don't know.
I'm not gonna. I think, it's kind of like Sophie's Choice. If you've ever seen that movie where she is forced to choose between her children, which one is going to live and which one is going to die, during the Holocaust. And I ain't choosing.
Okay.
Let somebody else make that decision. I ain't choosing.
Well, when as we wrap it up, was there anything you'd like to share with anyone who might want to find your work, or you want to list the names of a couple of other books that you've written?
Well, for both of those books, I think probably the cheapest you can get them is on Amazon, and then maybe for just about the same, it might be a little bit less on christianbook.com. It probably comes down to the shipping, but normally those two sites give you the best prices. And so you can just look for Luis de Molina, the book will come up. You can just type in Contemporary Theology and Introduction, and the book will come up. So it's easy to find. And other books that I've written are much more sort of specialized and academic in nature. So I wrote a book back in 2011 on comparing Japanese Buddhism and European Christianity in the early modern period. Now, if you're a specialist on one of those two areas, then that's really going to appeal to you. But if you're not, then it probably won't. I wrote a book back in 2007 called A Molinist Anabaptist Systematic Theology, which is where I try to put together the philosophical resources of Molinism with what I see as the biblical and ecclesiological resources of Anabaptism. And I mean, that book is the one that sort of like, if you want to know what I actually think, as opposed to what I'm writing about, that's the book to read. But again, that book is written on a scholarly level. It's published by University Press of America. And then my first book was also published by University Press of America. And that is a book on Balthasar Hubmaier, the 16th century Anabaptist theologian, a Central European synthesis of radical and magisterial reform. So in terms of accessibility, far and away, the last two books that I've written among those five have been the most accessible. Contemporary theology is the most accessible, no question about it. And then the Molina book would be second.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time as always. And even when you periodically post on Facebook, I'm a Calvinist, you're a Molinist, we're friends. We play nice, and even with our different perspectives, I always value the insights you offer, and it definitely always.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your interviews.
Yeah, well, I think people enjoy them. We talk about some pretty interesting stuff, so I appreciate it, man.
All right, great.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop the broadcast now, and I'll just shoot you a little message just with an extra thank you, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll connect in the future, okay?
Okay, great.
Take care, and God bless, brother. Thank you.
Okay, God bless you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.